John, would you like to give us a quick introduction to the US?
They have a relatively new regulation, which was formally adopted in February 2019. It's known as SK 1300, the Modernization of Property Disclosures for Mining Registrants. Now, a big difference here compared to some of the other codes that are joining us today is that whilst those are codes or guidance instruments, SK 1300 is a law which is enforced by the US Security Exchange Commission. So I think the importance of these best practice guidelines, is following what Greg was saying, is becomes even more pertinent here. Maybe the US has the sharpest teeth of the lot in that regard, and I'd certainly be fascinated to hear how ESG guidelines can be incorporated into it with that in mind. So thanks very much, and over to you, Sarah and Stella.
Brilliant, thanks, John. So Stella, would you like to just start off by giving us a brief overview with regards to your fabulous new code standard that we have here, and maybe some of the background to it?
Greg, I might get you to switch on your microphone again as well, just to chime in. So in 2018, in fact, it was the SEC passed the new disclosure standards, but they didn't actually get promulgated across into the Federal Register until early 2019. And so they became law and binding on all mining exploration companies as of 1st of January this year. And that actually is now law that the US and foreign registrants listed on the various US exchanges have to follow when undertaking mining disclosures to the public. So much of what's covered in the new regulation is said by the SEC to be CRISCO compliant, but there's also a number of topics of particular interest to the SEC themselves that they've woven in and out and throughout the SEC guidelines. So for nearly 40 years, the US used a code called Industry Guide 7. It was fairly simplistic. It was a guideline. It actually wasn't binding. It was just simply, the SEC asked you to do it. They would point to that particular document and they would expect you to follow. With SK 1300's promulgation, now we have a law. The document itself is about 400 pages, of which about the first 300 discusses the reasoning why the SEC came down on certain decisions and certain methods of presentation, and about 20 pages of it actually is what is required to actually comply with public disclosures in certain areas, and there's about another 2 pages that actually cover the content requirements of what's called a technical report summary, which is the SEC's version of a technical report under NI 43-101. So one of the things I wanted to bring out, if I could, was that ESG disclosure is still voluntary in the US for all industries other than mining, but there's a lot more pressure to have these types of disclosures from institutional investors. So I'm expecting to see that as more of these technical report summaries come out into the public domain, that you'll see pressure coming on to other aspects within the United States to start conforming and bring themselves in line with what's required of the mining companies. So I also want to bring up the fact that, to me, ESG considerations for mining are really wide ranging. So under the E, I see things like climate change, biodiversity, waste, water, land, and resource uses, pollution. So this would be things like acid rock drainage, your metals leachings, your air quality, visual quality, landscapes, archaeology, local history. So quite a wide range of things that mining companies have to think about under the E. Under the S, with things like human rights, labour practices, safety, health, community, diversity, whether or not the companies had a lot of violations and fines where inspectors have been through and actually visited their sites and seen issues, and obviously community outreach. Under the G, I would normally see things like corporate government, ethics, compliance, executive pays, diversity again, lobbying and taxation to be considerations that would need to be there. So many of these topics I just listed off are covered as part of the required disclosures, actually as part of the technical report summary, or as actual parts of the reporting that companies must do as an annualised basis to the SEC and to their investors. So some of those are covered in there quite clearly, and those would be the E and the S. I find that the more stringent internal controls requirements in SK 1300 actually are pretty likely to address quite a bit of the G, and you'll certainly find a lot of information around ethics, around compliance, around the violations and fines, your diversity, your executive pay, actually required to be at least partially discussed, if not more fully discussed. Referring back to what Catherine was talking about earlier this morning and started this particular one, when she was showing that there were certain times of certain studies where certain information comes in. Well, the SEC have actually put their long fingers into that as well. And so you now have prescriptive and scaled requirements for study documents, which start out with an actual general requirement for what's called an initial assessment, which is a document you must have in the background before you can report resources. And that has very, very specific requirements as to what you can and cannot have ready when you're actually looking at what you need to have for an IA. So I'm going to say for here, so for just even before you go anywhere else, by the time you get to the resources, you've got to have a list of the required permits and agencies drawn. You've got to determine if you've got significant obstacles to obtaining permits. You've got to identify all your pre-mining land uses. You've got to assess the requirements for baseline studies. You have to assume your post-mining land uses, your tailings disposal, reclamation and mitigation plans. So that's now going quite a lot further than most of the other codes globally. And because you must have these as part of law in the background, I think you're going to see a lot of companies in the United States, particularly this year, running around in circles to make certain they can actually meet those requirements, even before they get to reserves. These are things you need to think about for resources. When you get to PFS and FS, the requirements become even more prescriptive and even more deliberative in terms of what you must have addressed. And the SEC sets these out as at a minimum you must have. So it's not even like you've got some interpretation there, you must have those.
So with that, Stella, then, in terms of, I guess, the consequences of this, kind of very prescriptive documentation, I guess, in a way, coming through, are we going to see some mining assets be, say, devalued quite significantly because they don't have this, or that they can't prove it at the moment? What kind of changes do you think might be happening there?
I think you will see people making quite deliberate decisions as to whether or not the resources they've always carried under IG7 will actually be applicable to carry under SK 1300. And certainly I think these requirements to have the IA, PFS and FS that meet what the SEC wants. Remember that most other, well, to my knowledge, all other countries globally don't actually have these specific requirements as to cost accuracies, content requirements, so on, specified as part of your law. You have a fair bit of leeway to decide, well, in my particular case, I'm an aggregates company. I don't necessarily need to do that because certain positions you've got in there just don't apply to me.
Okay. So you might see people looking for some of the loopholes, but hopefully, of course, taking on board the intent with regards to the ESG component along with everything else. Greg, are there any brief words you'd like to add to Stella's fantastic summary there?
No, I think Stella's covered quite a lot. The issue over internal controls is something that is emphasized by the SEC, and this goes to governance. And it's the idea, and I think it was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, that you have different levels of corporate governance and governance over the project level, and then you even have governance over certain processes. And the way we see it, and we do these audits of companies, is governance is a system in place to maintain the integrity of a process. And when it comes to the SEC's new standard, the SK 1300, they're talking about the process of mineral exploration, mineral resource estimation, mineral reserve estimation. Those are the processes they're referring to. And they want to see internal controls over the process, which means a governance system. And that means you have procedures in place, you have checks in the system, you have oversight. And this also feeds back into civil liability defense, that if you have a good internal controls over your process, then you can show that as one of your due diligences. And even under the Canadian and parts of the US law, that gives you another defense, that you have a disclosure control procedure in place and you have good controls over your internal processes. That is, again, a defense against civil liability. So all these things, again, are interrelated. And the US has their Sarbanes-Oxley law for corporate governance, reporting on their internal controls, on financial reporting. The audit firms are being pushed to get more involved in reviewing resources and reserves because they are part of the financial reporting for mining companies. They feel they're being too accepting of just saying if the company has reserves, and for impairment testing, depreciation, amortization. So all of these things they're looking for, similar to what they do for financial reporting, the internal controls, the governance over that. They want to see that for operational reporting, for the business reporting. and in particularly for mineral projects, resources, and reserves.
So with that then, and for anybody on the call, so Sarbanes-Oxley is the financial side of things within the US. It's very prescriptive, and is one of the reasons why you often see very large departments that are dedicated to being able to meet the requirements of SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley, for example. So Stella, if I can come back to you, and we've had a great question that's just come in from one of our attendees, who and they say, so if SK 1300, do we think that SK 1300 is likely to be avoided by competent persons and consultants as a result of it being pretty terrifying? So do you think the fact that it's got so much teeth might actually put people off, and they might prefer to use one of the other options? What do you think?
There are no other options if you are a US-based company or you're registered on a US exchange. You're going to have to comply. So, you know, whether or not you feel comfortable with complying, the company itself will have to comply. Yes, anecdotally from SME, so Society for Mining, Metallurgy and Exploration, of which I'm a member, we are hearing of people who are saying they're very grateful that they're only 2 or 3 years off retirement and that they will never be involved with this type of a study. We are seeing other consultancies say, look, if we manage this properly, I think there is a way around it and a way we can do it, because we can see what Canada's done. And if we are very careful about how we do it, we will be in there. And there are law firms, and law firms always win. Law firms always get the money. And there are law firms out there who are making themselves into boutique answers, whereby the lawyers will control the shots and the geologists, the mining engineers, the metallurgists, the environmental specialists will be contracted to those law firms. And I can see them being used as cannon fodder to actually pull these reports together. I hate to use that and be that blunt, but I can see some of the legal firms actually making certain that they hire people who are maybe not as familiar with the legislation and some of the nasty teeth in there as the lawyers are, and then they would become the front for that particular one.
So just to be clear on this then, Stella, so the company must comply, but would an independent consultant that is supporting that company, would the consultants be liable, or is it the company?
Both would be liable.
Okay.
So the company is required to choose their qualified person. The company can choose a qualified person from within inside the company. Unlike Canada, there's no independence requirement in the United States, so your own corporate people can do it. But there are a few safeguards for independent qualified persons where they're able to rely on the registrant, the company itself, for certain portions of information.
Okay.
Environmental is one of those aspects. So the social environmental can be relied on by the company. And then under the Securities Act and the Exchange Act, the civil liability provisions don't apply to the qualified person for those sections if they relied on the registrant, the company, for that. And that was made clear in the tech report summary. It's put in a separate chapter, chapter 25 of the tech report summary. The information that you're allowed to rely on from the company, you can identify there, and that makes the qualified person not liable for that information if it's later used in support and of a form filed under the Securities or Exchange Act or a registration statement.
So Sarah, may I just ask one quickly? I don't want to take up too much time because I know you've still got other countries. One of the things that I wanted to answer, there was a question on your board this morning about if somebody actually became a competent person under the AusIMM or JORC or AIG, is that normally reciprocal across? And I just wanted to say that the SME actually is one of those organisations where our registered member category, we actually have a specific category where you are a recognised member in the competency actually of environmental, and that environmental actually is includes both permitting and social licence. So when you apply for your registered member status, there is actually facility to actually apply actually with your expertise in a particular area.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have stunned silence from many people in the audience who now realise that they're going to have to be really, really on it with regards to doing anything in the US, etc. But that's fantastic because we actually need all of this to have teeth and need people to do it. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from our wonderful team from the USA.